Welcome,
Thank you.
Jadon.
Hi.
Okay, can you just begin with your testimony, please?
Yeah, so my name's Jadon. I'm from here in Canberra, and from about the age of 16, I started to have an awareness that I kind of was a stressed person. And I think for any of you who knew me, who knows me, that I kind of grew up in a really lovely, loving family, and I don't remember being a stressy or anxious kid. Like didn't have that self-awareness. I might have been, but I lived what I thought was a pretty blessed life. I grew up in a family that believed in God, and if there were any healing needs, we prayed and we expected healing, and that's what we observed. We observed healing and God. And so by the time I got to 16, when I started to get this awareness that I was, struggling to get to sleep at night, that was probably the first thing I realized I was doing. So what I'd do is I would study at school until about 3 a.m, and basically pass out, go to bed knowing that I would pass out. I was doing that because I struggled to turn my mind off at night, and had this racing mind. And over time, the thoughts I would have start to get quite dark, and just thoughts I didn't want to have. And I just didn't have any kind of abilities to stop those thoughts. So obviously, I wake up, early in the morning and go to school. So obviously 2 or 3 hours sleep a night isn't great for mental health. So that kind of compounded this, and that became my new normal. Growing up in the Lord, I never desired the thing that the world offered. Going through high school, university, I never looked sideways at alcohol or drugs or partying. I loved my life, hanging out with my Christian friends, and we had good, clean fun. And that was enough for me. I was spirit-filled as a young kid, and I spoke in tongues. And so I loved my relationship with the Lord, but I had this almost altar kind of ego going on the side. And the pressure of masking that over so many years really came to a head, where I felt like I had to hide. With a smile on the outside, I was smiling, but on the inside, I just felt like such a fraud and such a phony. And that really was, what I came to understand later on was anxiety and depression, and would manifest in panic attacks and all sorts of things. And by the time I got to about the age of 23, 24, I was living with Toby and Paul Wright, and I had a job in hospitality. And part of, after a shift ends, part of it was socializing after the shift and drinking. And I made a couple of bad choices where I decided to join and be social with my work colleagues, and started drinking, and straight away realized that I could self-medicate with alcohol, and it would make me feel nothing and think nothing at night, to the point where I was very efficient at making myself black out to go to bed. And that was happening 4 or 5 nights a week. And obviously waking up in the morning feeling like rubbish, and knowing that I hadn't solved the problem, and that the problem still existed. And so then that endless cycle. And doing that was actually quite normal with the people that I hung out with, that the behaviors didn't stick out. But I knew, of being spirit-filled, that wasn't the right thing, but I couldn't quite get myself out of that kind of cycle. And then moved to the UK to do a bit of a kind of a working holiday over there. And that moved into a pub, lived above a pub. So that was a great decision. Just kind of did that for a year, and alcohol and drugs in London, drugs were readily available, and I never once purchased drugs while I was in London, but I managed to find myself the recipient of it many times. That just became the new normal. And then my sister came over to visit me, and a sister in the Lord, they came over at Christmas time to visit me, and we had a lovely holiday. And as they left, just something told me, go back to Australia. And I hadn't planned to go back. It was going back early, but I just had this conviction, and I came back to Australia. And this whole time, like I've got mental health issues. I got the anxiety, maybe depression. I could kind of get myself through them, but they might be 2 days of just not being able to get out of bed, you know, completely normal. And came back to Australia and was catching up with my good, you know, church friends, and knew that I wanted to come back, but I kind of had forgotten what to do, what that looked like, what do I do to do that? And I just kind of decided I'm just going to do the things I know. I'm going to attend meetings, even though I'm still dealing with stuff. I'm going to, you know, do all the things. And it was kind of an obedience, a desire to be obedient, and not be too hard on myself on getting it right or getting it wrong. Just go, I'm just going to and do that. And so I eventually I started fellowshipping on a regular basis. And what I would find though, I would try to stop drinking, but I'd walk past a pub and just the smell, it would just trigger, and I couldn't. There was this looking sideways a lot that I never had growing up, but I just still had this kind of part of me that kept looking sideways at all those things. But I was trying to do all the right things. So I'll probably leave it there. That's kind of part one.
So I guess what we're talking about is an anxiety disorder that eventually gets to the point where there's this inward process going on, fear, worry, and then there's outward process going on that you try and hide from people. And you try and hide a panic attack because you don't want anyone to see you have them. And so you end up with this process where even within your own brain, you're trying to live these two things at the same time. And there's treatments we can use, and alcohol actually is a treatment. Not a very good treatment, but it is something you can use. But it causes more trouble than it's worth, because when you actually first drink, you actually do get a bit of a boost of GABA released by the brain, which is one of the feel-good hormones. But very quickly, as it gets processed, it turns into a depressing, especially making yourself more depressed at the same time you're trying to fix it. So there's better choices, but let's move forward to what happened in another country.
Yep. So couple months. So that was in January of 2010. I was doing all the right things, but just had this, and probably still the guilt and the shame. So all through my life, I kind of had that guilt and shame, and I wouldn't talk about it. I kept it in, and that was probably the big difference before coming back to Australia in 2010, is that I just didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't have the language. I didn't really understand what was going on. And I was seeing a GP, and they had offered me medication, and I knew it wasn't the right thing for me at the time. But that's very specific to my circumstance. So in about April, myself, Paul Wright, another fellow, Ben Tolk, went on a hike in Nepal. So we flew to Nepal. And we were doing the Annapurna circuit, which is a popular walk. It's about a month. And the goal is to get to one of the peaks there, and that is 5,500 meters above sea level. And it's roughly equivalent, I think, to Everest Base Camp 1. I think there's 4 base camps for Everest, but it's the first kind of base camp. So pretty high. And it takes you about 3 weeks to walk up to that point, and then about a week to walk back down the mountain. And so went on this walk not really knowing what was going to happen, and walked up and getting closer and closer to the top. And then on the penultimate day, what they do is they kind of walk you up to 5,000 meters. You spend a couple of hours climatizing, and then you go back down to 4,500 meters for dinner. You sleep, ready for the final climb. And so we did that. Felt really good. That night they said, please try and eat as much as you can. Have a big dinner. When you're that high, you actually lose your appetite. Well, that's what they said. You're going to lose your appetite, so push through. You'll feel full, but keep eating. And I don't think I did that very well. I think I just kind of ate as much as I could, and kind of that was it. And then that night, I was just Paul and I were settling down for the night, and just kind of said to him, I said, "Oh, Paul, I just want to apologize or ask for your forgiveness. Just you've really invested in me a lot, and the last couple of years I've just really not been a great brother, and I have let you down." And I don't think at that time, I don't think he particularly thought I needed to do that, or it was just no worries, brother. And I think that really started this kind of whole thing in motion, where the next day we got up at 4 a.m. in the morning, and we had to climb the 1,000 meters up, and it was going to take us about 4 hours to do that. So you start early to avoid the bad weather. And we did that, and we started walking. I felt good. And we're walking, had our tea break. And then we set off for that last bit, and pretty much straight after the tea break, I just felt really sick and unwell, and started to just feel like I couldn't walk, and was walking, and I felt like 1,000 kilos of concrete. I was just shuffling my feet. So it is like a trek and trail. So the road is rough and not like a paved footpath. So you're kind of walking. And I was just kind of shuffling, and I couldn't move my arms, and I couldn't look up. I was just looking down, and I just felt like a big blob of concrete kind of trying to make its way up. And I was talking to the Sherpas, and they gave me some tablets. I don't know what they were or whatever. And they're like, well, there's only really one way out at this point, and that's kind of just to complete it. The only other option is if you get helicoptered out, and that's really not, they don't just push that trigger quickly. And so I was trying to push through, and I was able to make some progress. So I think they were just trying to see how far I could get. And we got to almost to the top of the hill, and I just knew I couldn't go any further. So I sat down on a rock, and I had been holding the group up as well, because you walk in a group of 20 or whatever, and they had been having to wait for me. So I just felt bad and rubbish, and sat down on the rock and just thought, oh, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but I just knew that this is it. I'll have to get helicoptered out or whatever. But I sat down. Paul Wright came over to me, and he must have wanted to pray for me. So he came over, and he laid his hands on me. And as soon as his hand touched me on the shoulder, I was instantly healed. He started to pray, but he didn't realize I'd instantly healed. He started to pray for me, just, I think just physically to have that healing. But what had happened was I just knew that everything that I'd been carrying for my life had just, at that moment, just been taken from me. And I just felt light as a feather. And I actually got up and ran to the top of the hill. And I think people were a bit confused, and I just knew that not only was I physically healed, but it was that spiritual, that shame and that I'd been carrying with me had been weighing me down. So that was in 2010, and I can honestly say since that day, it's just walking with the Lord has been just an absolute blessing. So obviously finished the walk. And yeah, just dealing with anxiety and all that stuff. I can just do that. I got married, I've had kids, and just we live a very blessed life. And I just know that's the Lord and His grace. So yeah, that's that second bit.
Amen. So I spoke to Jadon earlier this week, and he told me that story and went through how he was feeling as he was climbing the mountain, and described it, oh, I've got a bit of altitude sickness. And I don't have very much to do with altitude sickness. Adelaide doesn't really have any high mountains, so nothing much goes on there. And I went on the internet, had a bit of a look, and looking at what he's describing is actually severe altitude sickness. So at that point, what's happened is over here on the right, as you get higher, there's still the same 21% of oxygen in the air, but there's less actual molecules of oxygen because the pressure is then being clumped together. So as the pressure decreases, the amount of molecules you can see sort of on the top of the picture there, they're further apart. So when you breathe in, less of those actual molecules go in for you to capture and use. And when you get to severe altitude sickness, you've also got edema in the lungs, so you get extra fluid around. So even the oxygen you're trying to get in there is actually not able to get past. So at that point, you're done. So you certainly don't run to the top of the mountain at that point. So you see that from an altitude sickness point of view, that makes no sense. But also from an anxiety point of view, you can imagine physically when you feel terrible. I think most of us in the middle of a cold or a flu, particularly us blokes, our mental health drops as well. Is that fair? Ladies, you agree? Most of the time, yeah, they're whinges, yeah. So that's what happens. So your mental health is going to be at the worst at that point. And to have that miraculously change really shows what the Lord's done. There's a couple of other things I wanted to bring out about this particular testimony is still doing things that he knew didn't align with his beliefs or what we would have people do, and dragging yourself back into this hall. And that's something that I think a lot of us can learn from, of not giving up on ourselves and not giving up on what God can do for us just because of something we're struggling with. And I think that's something you can learn from listening to this sort of story about, okay, yeah, it didn't just instantly disappear. We've heard stories today about things that did instantly disappear. We've heard stories that have taken 4 or 5 years. This story took longer than that. And what we're going to do in a little while is actually have a prayer line. And a lot of us have had things that we've been dealing with for many years. I know for our family, we had a child who spent, better part of 14 years, plus if you include when Lisa was pregnant with him, attempting to die on a fairly regular basis and having a pretty good shot at it. And he was completely healed a few years ago from his prayer. And in the middle of things, sometimes you can't actually find your pathway out or how to keep going. But these stories are an example for all of us about how to actually hang in there. And I think being able to throw a few medical slides up and describe things, hopefully it helps to give you a bit of a broader picture of what's really happened. But the people sitting on that chair have done all the work really in describing what the Lord has done in their lives.